It was night, and not long after, the knights of the Imperial Guard arrived at the entrance of the cave, and upon seeing what had happened, their eyes widened in surprise and confusion. The entrance of the cave was filled with knights, and on the ground there was a mountain of null corpses. The knights were in shock to see that someone had killed so many nulls. Vikir, who wore a hood, began to observe them with a serene gaze in silence. The expedition to subdue the null village concluded with the arrival of the Imperial Guard. When they arrived, Miss Yorubaros had disappeared, leaving behind a great amount of riches. With the help of carts, the knights began to fill bags with gold coins to take them out of the cave. In the middle of the night, they loaded all the coins into their carriages and prepared to leave. That was how all the loot was confiscated by the Imperial Guard. It was already daytime, and Pin had his face full of bandages, but his eyes were shining with joy and there was a smile on his face. Not long after, Vikir, who was holding 2 bags full of gold coins, appeared, and with a cheerful gaze mentioned that this was the money he had obtained after selling the loot, and receiving the substantial reward for the expedition to annihilate the nulls. The eyes of Pin, who was lying in bed with his body full of bandages, began to shine peacefully, and he started to ponder in silence. Vikir began to gaze toward Pin, and with a smile mentioned that the heat from the fire and the smoke had damaged the leather, but he had sold the bones, teeth, and claws for a large sum of money. Upon hearing this, Pin came out of his thoughts and his attention fixed on Vikir, making a smile appear on his face. Vikir sat in the chair and with a worried expression asked about his wounds. Pin interlaced his hands, turned towards our boy, and with a sincere gaze revealed that every joint hurt. But the doctors had said that once he recovered, he was not going to have problems living a normal life. Upon hearing this, Vikir realized why Pin had reached the rank of graduator. Vikir handed a bag of gold coins to Pin, which fell into his lap. This was a gift. Pin opened the bag and saw that it was full of shiny gold coins. His eyes widened in surprise and his jaw dropped. He had never seen so much money before. Vikir had included a good sum as payment for Pin's help during the expedition and to cover medical expenses, since he knew that in his current state, he was not going to be able to work for some time. Pin began to gaze at the ground, not knowing what to say. While sunlight was entering the room through the window, he clenched his fist and asked if now Vikir was going back to the academy. With a calm expression, Vikir nodded. Pin didn't even lift his head to look Vikir in the eyes. He was happy to have been able to be, even if just for a moment, next to the hero of Baskerville. Vikir's attention fixed on him and his eyes began to shine with curiosity and confusion. Our boy remembered that Pin knew a lot about monster ecology, and upon hearing this, Pin's eyes widened in surprise, making his jaw drop in shock. He extended his hands and with a proud smile revealed that in his youth he had traveled across the entire continent, so he could perfectly distinguish the habits of monsters, the location of their nests, as well as subspecies, variants, subtypes, and superior species. With a lost gaze, Vikir got up from the chair, turned his back to Pin, and began to walk away. Upon noticing this, Pin's attention fixed on our boy and his eyes filled with when Vikir asked him to wait here. Pin's eyes filled with tears of joy. Vikir turned his head and with a joyful gaze made it clear that he was going to need his help again. Pin began to gaze at Vikir in silence, not knowing what to say. At the same time, at the academy, Professor Venci Morgi was in his office working. His desk was full of mountains of papers. He was somewhat furious since he knew that he would have to do all the work of the academy by himself. While he was distracted, someone started knocking on his office door. Venci Morg came out of his trance, lifted his head and gave them permission to enter. It was Dollars, who was holding several petitions. With a confused gaze, Venci Morgi asked why she had come. Dollar's eyes began to shine with seriousness, and she revealed that she had come to talk about the classmates who needed help with scholarships. She approached Venci Morg's desk and began to show him the petitions. With a curious gaze, the professor began to read carefully, and Dollars explained that these were the petitions of students who, due to family problems, would not be able to continue next semester. The petitions included data from those who could not maintain good grades because they worked part-time and from those who avoided working in order to obtain the scholarship. She began to stare at the teacher with a serious gaze and made it clear that among the students who had received the scholarship, there were some who needed a re-evaluation. She also mentioned that there was a considerable number of students who, although they came from wealthy families, forged their documents to appear as if they were from poor households and thus obtained scholarships fraudulently. It was necessary to recover those scholarships and redistribute them among the students who really needed them. Venti Morgi began to stare at her and his eyes widened with rage. Little by little he was losing patience, pointing at dollars with his finger. He made it clear that the scholarships were granted according to school regulations. As president of the student council, she was the one who had to respect and enforce those rules. With a furious gaze, she placed her hand on the table and asked the professor to review again the disadvantaged students that the regulations might be overlooking. Venti Morgi was furious to see that she was saying he had to do the work twice, with eyes shining with determination. Dollars made it clear that as president of the student council, she had the obligation to raise her voice for the difficulties of the students. With an angry expression, Venti Morg questioned who was going to take responsibility for the burden involved in him having to do the work twice, knowing that she was not someone who would double his salary. Little by little, Dollars also began to lose patience. Her eyes began to shine with contempt upon seeing that Venti Morgi was upset because he had to do the work twice. Placing her hands on the table, she began to stare intently at Venti Morg and made it clear that this was a matter affecting the future of the students. The tension in the room began to rise, and just then, our boy opened the office door. The attention of Venti Morg and Dollars focused on Vikier, and their eyes widened with curiosity. They didn't know what he was doing there. Our boy, who was holding a bag full of gold coins, began to show a serene gaze. Seeing that he had entered the professor's office without even knocking on the door, Venti Morgi mocked him by asking if his parents hadn't taught him manners at home. Upon hearing this, Vikier began to remember his father and the manners he had taught him, and with a smile, Hugo said that the family motto was to respect the strong. Vikier began to gaze toward the ground in silence, making Dollars feel somewhat confused. Venti Morg began to touch his face, closed his eyes and asked why Vikier had come, not knowing if he too had come to complain about not having received a scholarship. With a confused gaze, Vikier began to walk toward his table. Dollars' attention was fixed on our boy, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat curious. Vikier left the bag of coins on top of Venti Morgi's table. The professor's attention was fixed on the bag and his mind filled with curiosity. Our boy opened the bag, revealing the shiny gold coins. With a sincere gaze, he began to observe the professor and revealed that he had come to pay his tuition. Upon seeing the shiny gold coins, Venti Morgi's eyes widened in surprise. With a suspicious gaze, he asked where Vikier had gotten so much money. Our boy adjusted his glasses and mentioned that he had participated in the expedition against the gnolls. By chance, the fire he had lit while resting fell on the gnoll cave, and the swarm was completely annihilated. Venti Morg placed his hands on top of the table and began to stand up. According to him, this made no sense. With a calm gaze, Vikier said that Venti Morgi could ask Minnie Pin, the guide who had accompanied him, and also questioned whether with this amount of money he would be able to pay for next semester's tuition. Venti Morg began to observe the gold coins carefully and his eyes expanded with curiosity. He picked up several gold coins and left them on top of the table, mentioning that this was more than enough. Vikier could pay full tuition for all 4 years at once in a single payment. Vikier began to gaze at the ground, and said that the rest of the money was also to pay for tuition. Dollars' attention was fixed on our boy and she couldn't help but sweat. With a serious gaze, Venti Morgi made it clear that the amount of leftover money was too much just to pay for tuition. He didn't know if our boy was thinking about buying a building. According to him, Vikier was aiming for a professorship, not a student position. With a calm expression, Vikier asked Venti Morg to use the rest of the money for students who had not been able to pay their tuition. Upon hearing this, Dollars' eyes widened in surprise. She couldn't believe it. With a confused gaze, Venti Morgi questioned whether Vikier really intended to donate all this money for scholarships. Vikier nodded his head but mentioned that under one condition. The condition for receiving this money was that students must complete a certain number of volunteer hours at an orphanage. With a serene expression, Venti Morgue began to point at Vikier with his finger, and asked if he wanted to give the scholarship a name, and suggested calling it the Vikier Scholarship. Our boy wanted to remain anonymous, so he decided to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. Upon hearing this, Dollar's eyes filled with surprise. She put her hands over her mouth and couldn't help but blush. With eyes shining with determination, Vikier asked Venti Morgue to call the scholarship Perry Scholarship. It was already late and the sun was setting, and somewhere in the academy was the student council room. In this room were President Dollars and the others. Students had heard that this time an important scholarship sponsor had appeared. According to them, this was incredible since now one could obtain a scholarship by doing volunteer work in an orphanage. It was said that noble and powerful families were excluded from scholarships. Dollars clasped her hands and began to ponder in silence. No one knew who the anonymous donor was that had saved the lives of underprivileged students at the academy. With eyes full of curiosity, she couldn't help but wonder what Vikier's true identity was. She began to imagine Vikier and the others. Our boy had obtained first place in the written midterm exam, and also ranked among the top in the practical part. He was a very conscientious student, without flaws and with good relationships with his classmates. She began to remember when Vikier was in Venti Morgue's office. She knew that the eyes hidden behind the glasses seemed cold, but she couldn't know what was inside Vikier. The image of Vikier sitting with Perry came to her mind. Perry was a girl who had been sacrificed in the fight against Dantalion, and Vikier still remembered her. She stood up and began to walk. For her it was clear that Vikier had a warm heart hidden behind his cold exterior. Her eyes began to shine with love and she couldn't help but blush. She reached the door of Vikier's room and remained silent. She wanted to see Vikier and talk to him. With eyes full of nervousness, she began to bring her hand closer to the door. This feeling was one of responsibility and debt. Like someone who had seen the end of Perry together with the Nightblood Hound during the fight against Dantalion. Just then, Piggy, who was scratching his neck, opened the door, and upon seeing Dolores, his eyes filled with surprise and curiosity. Dolores and Piggy remained silent. With a confused gaze, she asked where Vikier was. Piggy turned toward the room and with a sincere expression realized that she had come looking for Vikier. Piggy mentioned that he didn't know where Vikier was now, since he always wandered at night. Upon hearing this, something caught Dolores' attention and her eyes began to shine with surprise. Piggy started touching his head, closed his eyes, and with a nervous expression admitted that the room was empty. The lower part belonged to Vikier. But he couldn't have much luggage there. It was as if he were someone who could leave at any moment. Dolores' eyes began to shine with curiosity. Piggy turned his head and with a sincere expression admitted that Vikier seemed to have some and, as a roommate, he was worried that he would leave. Once Piggy turned around, his eyes widened in confusion. Dolores left the room, turned her back on him, and began to walk away. Piggy started touching his head and his eyes filled with confusion, while the sunlight was illuminating the hallway. Dolores began walking away and she couldn't help but wonder if Vikier was the Nightblood Hound. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,